Hey everyone, Ben Mosier from Hired Thought here, and on August 2nd, I had the absolute pleasure of sitting down with Tim Ebenezer to talk about mapping. Tim is the director of digital at Foundation SP, where he works to help organizations best deploy their resources to make lasting change and impact, something I care about, and I'm sure you do as well. We got to dive into the world of professional services and what it looks like to apply mapping in that space. We even sat down and ran through a hypothetical example with policing in the UK. We go step by step through the mapping process and really show what it looks like to dive into this kind of thing. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I'm sure you will as well. Thinking about everything we've talked about already, how even though you and I are both years in our journey of worthy mapping, and we both still feel like beginners,
Mm.
who would benefit the most from hearing from you?
Yeah, so I think what I find is, as you said, although it's been 3 years probably since I first started looking at these techniques and starting to apply them to different contexts, the number of opportunities that I get to start from a blank sheet of paper are so few and far between that it makes it feel like each time you're discovering something new. And actually,
Yeah,
sometimes you sit down and you try to manufacture a context to map because you want to learn more about it. But actually, when it really works well, is when you can see a new situation and you can apply it to that. So whether that is going
yeah,
into a new customer and saying, right, we're in a situation now with this customer, let's get a blank sheet of paper out and let's have a look at what the situation is. What are the components that we're working with? Where do you want to be? And what does that mean? And what's the user or customer or internal stakeholder context that we're mapping? How does that play out? That's great because I can do it in that context. But the opportunities to start from that piece of paper that's blank, come up every now and again. They come up in that situation when we're starting something new and we're looking at a new offering in the organization, in the company, and saying, well, how does this fit? What could we do better? And I mean, I think that's where I would find personally a lot of value, is being able to hear from other people on that journey. And I think the journey that we're having personally with being able to identify what new things we could do and where we should invest time, is where I think value could be offered to the community.
that makes a ton of sense. So let's back up a little bit. Let's talk about your organization, what kind of work that you do, and let's provide a little bit of context. I'm really interested to hear a likely story about the kind of work that you do with clients. But let's start from there. Tell me about
Yeah,
yourself.
yeah. So I work for FSP. We're a small company in a small town in England called Reading, and we are about 50 people at the moment. We're growing reasonably rapidly, but I mean, at a steady pace in line with our values, and that's very important to us, is our values and being a company that has profit for a purpose at sort of the heart of what we do.
Yeah,
Um, and we've just launched a small product, so a product team with a handful of people in it, and actually using mapping techniques to look at what should we do. Actually, I came into the situation from a point of view where actually they'd already made some decisions on where to go, and actually being able to circle back from that and say, are all of these the correct decisions? Are we investing in the right places? Are there partnerships that could make more sense? Because why would we go and build new things when other people have already been in that space? Has been one context, and then the other context is internally, as I said, when we are sort of working on potential new offerings, potential new ways of doing things, or indeed tweaking how we do things. That's been a really
yeah,
interesting one. So thinking about, we are a consultancy primarily. We are we offer professional services to our customers. So both in terms of saying, well, are we doing that the right way? Professional services is one of the fields. I was contemplating this yesterday, actually. One of the I was thinking there are a few fields where lots of things seem to still exist at the genesis end of the scale, of the evolutionary scale, and
hmm,
where things keep on being done at the genesis end, so things are continually custom built.
yeah,
And I was just thinking, why is that? And professional services is definitely one of those industries where perhaps you could say the industry is incentivized to keep on inventing at that end, perhaps.
yeah,
Um,
perhaps.
but equally, what value could an organization offer if it made the journey of evolving some of that, and custom building what is truly valuable, which is actually the evolution of techniques like mapping, like different frameworks that can be used, and using that as part of the value offer, and spending more time on that really than necessarily on writing reports over and over again that are custom made from the ground up each time with largely same outcome, same content. And so how that then translates into a customer context is actually using the framework itself becomes a part of the evolutionary scale for us, or the in this case mapping becomes part of that that process, that both we are evolving how we're using it, so we get more reuse out of the the components each time, and it becomes a more productized entity for us.
Yeah.
Equally, then for the customers, we're sort of going, right, well, looking at you as an organization, if you're in this industry, what are the typical what's the typical situation that we're working with, and almost laying those maps over each other and saying, this is where you are and this is what might perhaps be typical. What's what's working, what's not working. That's one way of saying, actually, do you want your landscape to look the same as other people in your industry? And in some cases that's a yes, some cases that's a no. But it's a really interesting exercise to go through to say, actually, what we're talking about is a business that has has many components, has many parts, and you can evolve that in different ways. But how you evolve that is going to place you in a different landscape compared to others in your industry, or actually in parallel industries who are doing similar things. And that's been a very powerful message of thinking about the journey that people are going through. That's more than just this is maturity model. This is bad, needs to be good. That's a very
not very
simple
nuanced
way. Well, exactly. Yeah, not very nuanced. So that's been interesting for us.
No, I think you're hitting on a really interesting and important problem, and you're contrasting it to the sort of situations where you can start over and start fresh, right? On the one hand, right, that's greenfield opportunities. You get to design something from nothing, which means there are no existing commitments, no inertia that you have to deal with, no real transition that you have to facilitate, except one from nothing to something. When you're dealing with an agency that already exists and you already have kind of a rough way of doing the work, even if it's in Genesis and custom every single time, people have internalized the knowledge of how to do that stuff. And so you are starting from something that already exists, and therefore it already has the inertia. The way you price your services even probably has a bunch of assumptions built into it that it's going to constrain you from being able to do something new or do something productized. But I 100% agree. This is a huge problem, and it's one that I've experienced in a couple different contexts. And I'm going to share something real quick. I once had an experience working kind of alongside one of the bigger consultancies out there in the wider world, just not as like I was kind of like a participant in a project with them, and I could see what they were doing, and I noticed something really interesting, and that was they were doing exactly what you said. They were using productized forms of certain things. Now, some of them were problematic, but a lot of them saved them a lot of time, helped them build up intelligence about what to do in the context. And I've tried to take that to heart and really think very clearly about that. Like when I'm in a consulting sort of engagement, how basic is it to know who the people are in the system, know where they sit in the client hierarchy, know what kinds of things they're interested in? Like, this is basic stuff. Maybe it belongs in a CMS, like a relationship management system. Like, I don't know. So a CRM. So like thinking about that kind of stuff, like it looks brand new from our context when we're doing the work, on the ground floor. It looks like nobody's ever had to think about this stuff before. So we should probably invent our own way of doing it. In the tech space, that becomes tempting to be like, I'm going to write a little program to do this thing that we need just for us. Turns out a CRM is actually the more evolved form of that thing. So
quite
basic stuff like that, right?
Yeah, no,
Something like that?
absolutely. And I think, yeah, and just as you're speaking, I wonder, to some extent, and maybe this is too meta, but if you think about an organization that works that way, and what you were saying about it being ingrained in an organization to exist at the sort of genesis end of the evolutionary scale, um, is that somehow that's almost become productized in the organization, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
So
our standard practice is to custom build everything.
quite, yeah, exactly. And then you build almost utility models on top of that that say, well, to
Yeah,
custom build a thing looks like this. And yeah, sorry, that's it's a strange concept, but
that's true.
is that something you're seeing? Because I think if you observe sort of the large consultancies, the growth path that is needed is to keep on growing through people. And so the way to do that is to have quite a lot of Genesis type work that is able to be farmed out to small communities of less experienced consultants in general.
Mhm.
Um, is probably my observation. And so actually, it's somewhat self fulfilling, but then it's relying on a productized form of probably some work that should, that initially was very, very novel in a sense, but that productized form is not of the form that it can be used directly, but that it needs this overlay of custom build on top of it, uh,
Yeah,
of interpretation, etc. So I think it's fascinating, and perhaps it's a pointer to where the professional services industry has gone/come from, or and probably is still going, in terms of being incentivized to behave in a particular way.
yeah. I mean, what would drive us to change and improve is an interesting question. Um, and I guess what we both know from our own experiences is that when we actually have to sit down and map something, we start to learn some things. We learn about the space, we learn about the context, and then the decisions so the errors of omission, right? The decisions we didn't make suddenly come up to the forefront and they start screaming at us. It's like,
Yeah,
why didn't we make the decision to actually use a more common form of something instead of reinventing the
yeah,
wheel ourselves? Now,
yeah,
the interesting thing about that bias is that a lot of times we are applying theory that just isn't present in the organizations that our clients are, like our client context. Like they either have been so laser focused on their work, or they have never been exposed to certain kinds of theories about how to do work. And so what does that look like for you when you're working with your clients?
yeah. I think that's a really interesting one, and the parallel that draws me to, and where mapping can really help, is sort of the can't remember what the name of the sort of phenomenon is, but it's the common pattern you see with gamblers where you've invested a certain amount in terms of, you've put so much in, and it's sort of, well, I'm just going to put more in because I'm going to win at the end. And I think you see that pattern a lot with organizations. Is that especially when they've invested at the custom build end of the spectrum, and they've got something, usually a behemoth that requires an incredible amount of investment to keep going and to keep in that form. That there is a bit of that mentality that we've gone so far, we may as well just put this little bit more in there anyway, because perhaps eventually that will start. We'll be able to realize some incredible return on investment from that, rather than rethinking the approach and going, well, okay, one, that was wrong, because as you break apart the component parts of what that is, all of these bits could be all the way over here on the map. They shouldn't be here, because the classic, why are you building the kettle, why are you building the heating element, that classic sort of question. And whether that is custom identity provision, whether that is data centers, whether that there's so many examples in there where you go, well, it's in a room downstairs in the office, and it's hosted down there, stuff. Okay, and why? And you start to peel off these layers of of the components that sit within there, and then think about again, that idea of, and what is a good mode of delivery for all of these things, because you're delivering them. Part of it being this behemoth inside your organization is that you are locked into delivering it in a particular way that potentially doesn't meet the organization's needs. And I think combination of using that tool, but also pointing to the fact that really it comes back to the conversation we've had previously around agile techniques and the use of the word agile, whether it's capital agile or lowercase agile, as a shorthand for organizations wanting to be more responsive. And actually responsivity comes from applying the right sort of methodologies, techniques, or inventing, in some cases, methodologies, techniques where it is really appropriate. Again, sort of applying to that context, and helping them understand and unpick that. I think that's been that's really been a interesting use of mapping, but also that interesting way of showing actually what you've done is create this absolute monster over here, and you could get more value into the organization, but you need to go on a journey to do that. And that's not an easy conversation. And as you say, when somebody's invested millions into something, we think about all the organizations that invested in private cloud.
Yep.
There's a lot of both emotional, financial, and political capital that is tied up in maintaining the view that could return and give a reasonable return to the organization. And picking through that is as much the challenge. And that's coming back to sort of the mapping and how that can help with that. Yes, it can help communicate that there is a better way, but you still need that overlay then of talking through, well, what are the personal political implications for people? And this is always the incredible challenge of being an advisor, who is truly true in terms of integrity to your position, and actually sometimes the job is to hold your customers' feet to the fire and say, look, you said you want to get here. Well, if you want to get here, this is what this means. And often it's that can be a potentially damaging conversation for me as a consultant, but it will be a more productive conversation for the customer if we have that openly.
Yeah, and that's where trust really comes in. It's the currency of how well anyone can work together, right? If you can build the trust in order to be able to have that difficult conversation, right? Because otherwise, I mean, you're there to serve them, right? Otherwise, they're going to run off a cliff, and that's really the thing that you're trying to prevent. So maybe let's get concrete a little bit. This has been excellent background, and I think it helps a lot of people watching sort of understand where you're coming from and what you're hoping to accomplish when you're working with clients. So I want to run this by you. Would you like to maybe tell a likely story through a map of what it's like working with you? What kind of things, what kind of clients do you work with? And we could make one up and map out their situation and talk through the kinds of things that you would talk through with them.
Yeah, sure.
That sounds like an interesting exercise.
Yeah, let's try it. Let's see how that goes. Cool. So we probably do two things with customers. Generally, we'll work with advising them on strategy, big S strategy, and we'll work with providing technical solutions for them as well, usually as a result of that strategy. So I guess we could work with this either way. One is, well, as an organisation, what are the user needs that we are sort of serving as a professional services organisation? But equally, as as customers, so we have customers really, in the construction industry, in education, in the secure spaces, in policing, etc. There are different challenges in each of those. Policing is a really interesting one, because if you look at least how policing works in the UK, it's a bit different in the States, where there's tens of thousands of police forces. But in the UK, there's 43 police forces, each who have the authority to do things in their own way. And it's a really good example of where you've got actually a set of very common needs and a set of potentially common services and common utilities that underpin, but equally a a market and an attitude that may push things in a very different direction depending on the authority that you're dealing with, police authority that you're dealing with. So
Yeah.
that's quite a sector. So yeah, I guess we could do it from either end.
That police example seems really interesting because one of the things that I always it's quite a shift in my mind when I visit the UK is how different policing works. And in the US, like it's not even that policing is all the same. It's just the fact that it's actually really fragmented. You have, I always think of the United States as kind of like an EU-like entity, just kind of like loosely kind of gathering together all these different states, and each has like their own level of, you have state police, you have local police, you have constables, you have sheriffs, like all this kind of stuff, and federal forces as well. It's like it's hard to keep track of it. And when I say policing in America, it's like, well, what kind? And it's interesting that you point at that as well in the UK, because you said 43 different agencies that are focused on policing in a different way. But the context is a little bit more interesting, the way that it's approached in general. So it would be cool to maybe talk about one or two of those kinds of sort of policing contexts, maybe. And I can be your scribe. I can write down sort of things as you talk through it, and I can. I don't know if you've ever used Miro before. I find it extremely helpful for kind of remote situations like this. And so what I'll do is I'll just share my screen real quick. So just have a Miro board up. And I guess the first question I have is, let's talk about the scope. And you're in here too. Awesome.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the scope a little bit.
Cool. So let's think about a common need from a police perspective. So I guess one of the interesting things with the police is obviously while there are there's 43 forces in England and Wales, I should say, rather than in the UK, and England and Wales rather than UK and Wales. Sorry. The Scottish people and Northern Irish people won't like that otherwise.
Please forgive me. I'm not sensitized.
And so what's interesting, I guess, is that those 43 forces they're dispersed by area. So that will be, for many of our counties, there'll be a county police force. So we'll have Hampshire County Police, Thames Valley Police, we'll have Sussex Police, Surrey Police, etc. So they carry out the same activities, but in their localized context. And so what's very interesting is if you look at a particular user need. So if you take, for example, that there is a need for certain police officers to be able to get a warrant to do something. So that's a starting point, and from that need, they, depending on the force, may have one of many systems to do that, and equally they will be interacting with a process to do that. So typically, that process, and tell me if I'm going too fast, Ben. Apologies.
You're perfect. Thank you.
So typically, that process will involve an amount of firstly getting approvals to get a warrant, because in order to say make a search on a property, there'll be an approval needed, and depending on the type of warrant that they'll need to get, they'll need to access potentially a secure area. So there may be some security implications of the warrant that they're getting.
And what do you mean by a secure area?
So the information on the warrant that they're getting may be classified to some extent. So they will need access to a system or access to a way of communication that is sufficiently classified, let's say. And so what's quite interesting here is that although there's 43 forces, getting a warrant may require approval from the same entity, regardless of which force it comes in from. But it's not necessarily true that they will all follow the same or use the same systems for gaining that access, or at least
Okay, so that's really interesting. So same entity, different systems.
potentially, yeah.
Okay, tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So what tends to happen is, I mean, there will be often, there are a number of alliances of forces that will work together to make common processes, to make working practices better, and to utilize their spending power as well more effectively. And I think what's probably interesting here is the while the approving entity could be the same, the and there may be some commonality in the way alliances are doing things. At some point, it may float up to a point, and equally at that point, they may, the approving entity will only want one way of doing things. So what you may have is a situation where there are lots of disparate ways of doing things at the at the level of each of the individual forces, but at some point there is a roll up of some kind, a aggregation of some kind, an interoperability, you could say, into something that the approving entity can work with.
Right. So like a standard interface that they expect. These are the 5 points you'll need, and whatever that would end up being like.
Yeah, something like So, and I guess thinking through then what the other component parts of this are. There's sort of the systems and process element equally, and we've covered some of the people element, I guess, really with the approving entity. And then what you've got equally is from a people perspective, you've also got the officer, and typically some sort of back office function that is supporting with this activity, that typically are focused on doing different things.
Okay.
So an officer is typically focused on preventing crime, on dealing with particular incidents, while the back office function is clearly more focused on supporting the officers in various activities. Now, all of them are, the officer knows that in order to carry out the activity that they want, they need to carry out in order to investigate the incident that they're investigating, they need a warrant in order to move forward. But sitting below that, then there's all of these constituent parts that are then at various stages of sort of evolution. So you have in some forces, probably, and I'm conjecturing some of this here, not having worked in this space across all forces, but in some forces you have what is a reasonably standardized system that is used to run this process. In some, you have a more custom-built system that typically will have been bought in. It won't have been custom-built within the force, but it will have been custom-built to the needs and process of that force, if that makes sense.
Totally.
So,
yeah.
And those are probably the two main. So you have something that's sort of more productized at the cusp between sort of custom and product, I'd say. Definitely not sort of Genesis custom, but sort of custom to product, because it will have been configured to an extent to accommodate the needs of the particular force. So even if you had 10 forces, same product, underneath there will be some marked differences in the way the process is administrated, in perhaps what type of individuals do the interim approvals that may be required. And so there's layers to this in terms of where you're sitting in the force picture, and then you can sort of I guess that's probably a good set of initial sort of entities to be thinking about within the process, and how they interact. I guess behind this then potentially sits a whole lot of additional supporting infrastructure and utilities of various kinds, and some of those again more at the custom end. So you have various interfaces that are required in order for pieces of software within the police space to work together. So, for example, police forces will typically work with a case management system, with a police focused records management system, and again, while that will typically be a product. Sorry, I'm thinking of those two things probably together in most cases. The case and the system. While those will typically be sort of a product based, they will again be relatively heavily configured to be particular to the force and the way it operates.
Yeah, let's talk about that real quick. So when we think about the disparate geographies and just the different needs that each police force is trying to meet. I mean, so you noticed my slip earlier when I was writing like UK and Wales, right? So like, okay, I'm from the States, I'm ignorant, that's fine. But when you have those kinds of important subtleties, right, in how you go about policing, it can come down to what words you have on a form that you have to fill out, right?
Absolutely.
So if you need that kind of customization and sort of difference at the edge of of these organizations, people doing the work on the ground, then of course you need to be able to manage that variability and support it. The problem is,
of course,
that's really expensive to do if that's all you do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there is then the overlay into this of again, it is systemized, but actually the systemization of some of these processes are are carried out by pen and paper based systems that then utilize things like fax machines, perhaps, to transfer data between, because it can be a secure mode of operation. And actually, from one perspective, a fax machine is a great product that that relies on some utility services that are well known and well understood, but it requires a lot of interaction from a custom process for a back office function to be doing, which is filling out forms, chasing around all the signatures, making sure those, and then you've got the idea of verification of this, and the verification is incredibly custom in this situation then. So this whole idea that you've got a process that essentially should go from, as an officer, I need a warrant in order to investigate an incident that I'm dealing with, which then flows through to an approval process for that warrant flowing back to the officer with a with a approved or unapproved warrant, that then relies on this this need for a lot of custom interactions underneath, if that makes any sense.
That makes a lot of sense. So let's recap with what we've done here. So just like in terms of what it looks like to map, like this is kind of like the first couple steps. It's really just getting thoughts onto paper, like really talking about the scope of what we're dealing with,
Absolutely.
who we're trying to support, whose needs we're trying to meet, and what those needs are. This tells a really interesting story so far, right? You have individual officers who just need to get a warrant to do something, right? They're just trying to get their jobs done. And at the same time, you have these force level concerns of things like, how do we address the different geographies that that we're each in? We need to be able to have just enough difference in order to accommodate the real variability that's out there in the world. We need to be able to meet needs that are appropriate according to those different geographies. And at the same time, we can't we could all have such a much better time if we had a couple standardized processes behind the scenes where, yes, there's a gap between the standardized and the different, and that's where we
Yeah.
get this sort of transitionary domain. But we can work together to actually figure out where that would make sense to do. And so they need these alliances in order to talk about those systems and processes that are actually common.
Exactly. And typically those alliances are coming together to address some of that need for common ways of working and increased spending power. Equally, sense. I mean, and just to be clear, some of this problem is in the process of getting solved, of course, right? So, some of the common making sure there is a common process for doing some of this for certain types of warrants is being solved. But that in itself brings up an interesting definition, is that there is a split out based on what type of warrant actually are we talking about here? Is it a is it a search? Is it is it another type of warrant? There's particular pieces that then sit underneath that, depending on what kind of process ultimately the officer needs to go through. There's caveats to all of this. So, and I think this brings up a really interesting point, which is really important or certainly I find important when mapping, is you've got to hone down often. So it's really tempting, or I find it really tempting. It'd be really interesting to hear what your sort of view is on it, Ben. I find it really tempting to try to map the whole space, and what I find is I end up with a map with so many nodes on it that I then don't know what to do with it. And not only that, then it's really confusing to anybody who looks at it, because they start going, what's this mess of this spider's web? Is that a similar problem that you ever find?
Absolutely. It's 100%, I would say, the problem that people have when they first start mapping. And I'm going to use a little bit of collateral that I brought in here just in case we're going to have a conversation like this. So this is from Simon Wardley's book, which you can find medium.com/wardleymaps. He calls this the strategy cycle. And essentially, he says the strategy cycle consists of purpose, landscape, climate, doctrine, and leadership. Purpose is probably obvious. It's the game that we're playing. It's why we're all here. Landscape is this exercise that we're doing right now, making a map.
Yeah.
Climate is the external forces we need to be aware of that are affecting that landscape. And doctrine is the universal principles we deploy in order to essentially make our forces fit, get them ready to actually do the actual work. And then leadership is making decisions based on all of that, our capabilities, what's happening in our landscape, what our landscape looks like, and why we're here in the first place. So in my view, this, and Simon overlays the OODA loop to this, but in my view, completing the loop the first time is the most important thing. And so you could very easily get stuck in landscape forever trying to design, design the perfect representation of the system that you're in. That's something that I have fallen prey to so many times. And I think it's really, really helpful to scope things very tightly, recognizing that you're going to leave some things on the floor. Because truthfully, if you're mapping at all, you're going to make better decisions, period. So if you map and make better decisions over a really tiny scope, and you get comfortable and you're learning what this feels like, and then you expand the scope a little bit, or even if you do that 10 times with the same size scope, right? You're making a couple better decisions every day that are going to impact the way that you work and have a huge impact in the long run. They're going to pay dividends. So that's kind of the way that I think about this.
Yeah, no, quite right. And I think that, I come back to the idea that if you try to overly define the landscape, or you try to create a model that perfectly represents the thing that you're trying to that you're analyzing, you will just create it itself, because all you're doing is it's that idea of creating a model that's so perfect that it just becomes the thing that it is. And actually, what is much more useful is getting into the deciding and acting phases, which you can do from an abstraction, which is all we're trying to create, is a abstraction that is accurate enough to give us a picture of the landscape that we need to move in, and help us to make decisions on what direction to go, because we can see as we stand back that actually moving like this would make a lot of sense.
So if I come back to the example that we're working through,
Yeah.
we could get as detailed or as high level as we want. Like, so what I'll do is I'll
Yeah.
move this over here, and then I can paste this. What could we remove from this scope to just sort of have a more concise conversation?
Yeah, and I think this is where we'll get into a bit of creative fiction, let's say, with
Perfect.
a creative license with the scenario. I think what I find helpful is actually, we've got a really good example here of a node that is driving us down, or my experience would say is driving us down perhaps to a 2D level, which is we've got a node there that says get a warrant to do something.
Okay.
So perhaps if we made that more specific, we'd be in a better place to map that particular scenario. So we say we're getting a warrant to do to carry out a search, would perhaps be a good place to start. And I'll be the first to admit I'm not an expert on search warrants in policing, so there'll be a huge amount of creative license here. But I think it's
Yeah.
from my perspective, it's it's the process and thinking through that and how we map that's important.
Yeah, actually, that's a really important point that you just mentioned, though, because all too often, both when it comes to quantitative estimation and qualitative estimation, people often seem to get stuck on this idea that they don't have perfect information. Like, I don't know it, therefore I can't move forward. And one of the things that I think is very important is what I call like abductive mapping. So abductive thinking is what's the most likely explanation for something? Like what's the most likely version of this reality? And the truth is, if you take a decently educated guess, even if it's going and looking at Wikipedia for like a minute, you are going to be closer than you were before that, and you're going to make a better decision than you were before that. And when you show this to someone, they'll look at it and go, "That's wrong," and you'll go, "Great, excellent! You get to teach what it's like," and then they can help you.
Tell me what's right. Thank you.
Exactly. Yeah. So like I get excited about taking wild guesses about things because I know when I show them to someone who is actually an expert, they'll point out the things that I've completely gotten wrong. But for the work we're doing, like obviously we need to think about the system in a meaningful way. Taking a decent guess is a great way to do that. What were you going to say?
No, that's it. I mean, I remember an interaction with Simon on Twitter, which was exactly that. Which was, he put up a map of something. I said, "Well, why have you put this here?" He said, "Well, I put it there, and it might be wrong. And if it's wrong, that's caused a conversation to say, you're saying it should be over there. Well, tell me why it should be over there, and then we'll agree on where it should be." And that sort of drove home for me, part of how this can be used in a really constructive way in a decision-making process. So yeah, let's get back into this a little bit then. So if we think about the flow, as it were, and the various entities and how they join up. So in terms of the process involves potentially the fax machines, potentially the secure area, and certainly the case management system. Often between that, there's a lot of running around that the back office function is doing in terms of filling out forms, in terms of potentially looking in the case management system, transposing information onto a paper form, potentially rekeying from the case management system into the secure area because the two things can't connect together. So all of that is part of the process. That process is built up of actually a number of these nodes connected together that perhaps the case management system, yes, it is a product, probably with you could almost separate that potentially into two nodes, a product with a set of custom configurations on it that potentially look different in each force. And whilst those are at a higher level of evolution, what you've then got is a very particular, totally custom, probably not Genesis because it's a repeated task that people are doing, but they are doing it potentially in a slightly different way each time.
They're
It's
too
completely
like,
custom manual process that people are going through in the back office that is, filling out these forms, going and gathering approvals. There will be some encoded logic in these people's heads that if so and so is not available, I'll go and take it to somebody else and get the approval from them. But that's encoded only in their heads. But it's this sort of custom Genesis to custom process, because in reality it's, I'm Pat and I know that if Bill is off, I'm going to go to Bob. And perhaps if it wasn't Pat picking up the form on that day, you'd get a different outcome, which I think is fascinating.
absolutely, yeah. And it's that implicit information, the stuff that's inside people's heads that hasn't actually been externalized yet.
Yeah.
That one makes the system work. Like the system is working. Like that's
absolutely
the truth. Yeah. At the same time, it presents a challenge if we want to actually try. If we think it's something that should be evolved forward, like maybe we shouldn't be doing 10 different ways of putting papers into fax machines. Maybe we should actually have one way. And when we got that nailed down, we can talk about fax machines a little bit, right?
Yeah, well, exactly, and you bring up a really good point, because it's what you could take out of this, or what I certainly could take out of this, is that the problem is the paper, and the problem is not necessarily the paper, because you can transpose exactly the same problems into the digital space. So you could say, I will digitally transform this process, and it will be, the process will be fully digitized. And actually, at the end of that, what you have is exactly the same Genesis knowledge problem, which hasn't been moved into the, utility and into the, well-defined space. So, thinking about, data being that, the mode of operation being that focus on data being, really modeled and understood, rather than this unmodeled space that it lives in earlier evolution. Thinking about that could, it doesn't matter if that's, that could be systemized in a fax machine. It'd be difficult, but it could be. But equally, the converse is true, that you can have it all digitized and you can still have exactly the same problems, because the underlying issue hasn't been dealt with. So if we think about where we're starting to, place some of these things, actually that back office process perhaps is one that you start to see as an outlier sitting at the Genesis edge.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I think that's where, personally, as I'm mapping things, what I'm looking for is, as a consultant, you're often looking for the opportunities for your customers to do things with the least effort. And I find focusing on what is potentially sitting at that Genesis custom edge to generally be the easiest to move along in its evolution, and generally to have the lowest cost. Now, it's not always true, because there's an incredible opportunity cost often. There's an incredible change cost often. But in terms of, sunk cost and investment, where you have something sitting in the product space that is potentially bound to lots of custom stuff, there's a real case there. So sorry, I digressed a little bit into the.
No, this is critical though. Like, I mean, because Simon points at two, like I remember back at Map Camp, he pointed at two different examples that really like emphasize this point concretely. And one was the classic example of a data center sort of management context, where they were ordering servers and then racking them, but they were custom building the racks in order to custom fit the servers. And it was like they were trying to make that process more efficient. And when you zoom out, it was like, well, that's a custom process, but I mean, the answer could just be to buy standard equipment. And actually that will save this whole effort that you're looking for innovation in the digital transformation or whatever in the context of how to better do your rack customization process. We're going to get robotics into custom build, like CNC machines in the data center. If you've ever managed Sparks near data centers, very frightening thoughts. But and the other example that he came up with was like the paper weighing one, right? Where there was a process they were measuring the weight of the paper forms, because I forget the exact specifics, but it was essentially like what you were describing earlier with the fax machines, right? It's like they took a paper process and replicated it one-to-one into the digital space and had some sort of kind of the old metrics were in the new context. And as a result, they never got the benefits of the technology. They never got the benefits of the move forward. And so as a
Yeah.
consultant, like when we're looking at our clients and the situations that they're in, yeah, we're looking for like the really obvious opportunities like that. We have to be super careful about telling them about them. It's like, okay, so this is going to be a little bit much. I know that you have 30 people working on this one thing.
Yeah.
The rest of the world's doing something different. And so we need to figure out how to transition, help those people find other work to do and transition towards this new future. It's a difficult conversation. Where I'm hoping to see more companies going is the things that they have in Genesis and Custom are big bets that matter, as opposed to
Yes.
biases that have kind of taken hold.
Evolved over time. Yeah.
So
No,
let's
that's a really good point. And I think that point about the resolution of what you're looking at is really important in that case, because yes, whilst there is the opportunity space with what's sitting at the Genesis and Custom edge, if you are looking at it in too deep a manner, what you do end up is just digitizing it as is, because that's you've now moved it along, right? In a sense, it's now sitting within a product, where in reality, all you've done, what you've not mapped, is the piece that's sitting under it, which is still truly in that Genesis and Custom space. And so it's really important to get it right, that it's not the fact that it's a paper form that is there. It's the fact that it's the knowledge that sits underneath that is there. So I think if we were to start to join this up, I would say, the getting a warrant to carry out a search, in terms of that process, you're first hitting that back office function then. And that back office function is using some intrinsic knowledge. And I think that's the important piece here, is that there's some, I don't know how else I would explain it in this context, but they're using some intrinsic knowledge that is deciding probably how they then, that intrinsic knowledge is working with the case management system, its configurations, the fax machines, the secure areas, in order to gain a verification.
Yeah, and feel free to tell me, like, if I'm doing something, if I'm connecting these in ways.
I think you're joining these nodes up just right. Yeah.
And verification as well.
No, in order to get to the verification. So I'd say that the verification, and well, yes, I mean, yeah, and it depends. And again, I mean, something I found helpful, and again, it'd be good to get your view on this, is to use this tool and use different notation at times to denote different things. So the fact that the back office function is using this intrinsic knowledge, it's interacting with these systems and gaining a verification. They are all coming from the back office function, but we could denote that in different ways using different visual ways of representing that. That's sometimes something that I do just to help people understand why I'm linking things up in a particular way.
Yeah,
do you find yourself?
I am a strong advocate for adapting the notation to meet your needs, because there are so many things that we're trying to learn about how to represent these systems well. I mean, at the end of the day, it's entities and edges. We are trying to represent very complex things that happen that don't follow those, they don't color inside the lines. So we're doing the best we can. And so if you need to adapt the way that the system is laid out in order to represent something important, do it. Yeah, I think that's absolutely important. So what should I do here to make sure I recognize what you're pointing out?
I don't know. Perhaps if we put the line to verification in a different color, I think that would do for now.
Okay, from back office function to verification to color. Okay.
So, yeah, and
make it a little bit thicker so you can see it.
Yeah, it brings up a really, it's an interesting point. I mean, one thing, I've done, and I quite liked some of the early examples I saw of maps. Showed groupings of nodes and how you could think about them, and I've often used that as a, you're almost drawing islands, around your landscape. the other thing I always think of is where in maps you have the terrain, you have depth as well, and sometimes you need to represent depth in your maps. In a sense, you need to represent that some richness of data, and sometimes that is when I'm thinking about some things, I might go, well, actually, let's color in all the processes in a particular. Let's color in all the systems in a particular color. Let's color in all the people in a particular color, so that you can quickly visually see how that sort of interacts on that map.
Yeah, how does it help you make sense of the system in a more quick and like intuitive way? And I think that's going to depend on what context you're in. But I do the exact same thing. If I'm thinking about particular concerns, especially when it comes to intervention planning, if I'm just doing the value chain part of this, if I have a sense, like I haven't actually put the entities onto the evolution axis yet, but I have a sense that there's something that I want to pay attention to in particular about the way the verification process works. Yeah, I'm going to change the color of that so that it pops back out when I'm later in the process. So that's absolutely valid. Yeah.
Yeah, and you've just said something which probably points to probably your experience more than mine. Is I start putting things on the axis very early,
which
and actually.
I'll just put this out there. Like I am not doing this like every single time I do a map, it's different. And like I think actually that's probably the better thing to do is to get it on the map sooner, because you're getting through the cycle quicker. This time we're spending some time appreciating the system.
It depends as well when I'm doing it in a group versus whether I'm doing doing it alone. When I'm doing it alone, I tend to be jumping straight into the canvas and starting to place things, and then I'm constantly moving them around. Whereas in a group, post-its, it makes sense. People are, you are collaborating in that space. So, but equally, I tend to get people to go and put things on the map straight away, because it's a conversation point. You straight away get the no, that's wrong, and it's like, okay, that's fine. Yeah. So where do we move this? So,
and that's actually one of the things I find people have the most energy for, is learning about evolution first. They kind of, their eyes glaze over when they think about building the value chain. So I find that sort of inverting it like that is actually a really great facilitation technique to help get the energy to actually do the harder work, which is what are the things, what are the relationships between the things. I think people get that if it's the first step.
Yeah, and I think what's quite interesting from this conversation is obviously I think sometimes it's people think it's it should be a very fairly obvious thing, especially if you know the process well. It should be an obvious thing about what the actors are, what the nodes are, and how they link together. But I've found it's it takes a lot of time, and it's something that you need to continually challenge and continually evolve. And as you say, as you move towards intervention planning, ideas will still continue to come out. I think that will affect how you're viewing the landscape, and you need to keep that up to date, especially in
100%.
In organizations that tend to have uncontrolled activities going on, which is every organization. Well,
you're going to wander into situations where you're going to find that someone hasn't made a decision, and so a de facto one has been made. Like when it comes to design, when it comes to thinking about intentionality here in making decisions and systems, the system is designed. It just might not be by you. It might be actually by the status quo. It might be by chaos. It might be just by what societally we do by default. And so you're pulling out the implicit decisions or the non-decisions and realizing that you have to make decisions in order to move forward. And that's the thing, is you start changing the system in a way where before it might have kind of been designed on accident. And maybe that accident was working fine. And maybe it happened to fit just the right pattern for what you needed at the time. If you're mapping, you're probably noticing the ways that's not working for you anymore. And so now we make decisions. Now we start approaching it more intentionally. So let's try to get this onto a map, and maybe we don't have to do all these.
Let's start moving these down. So agree. So I think the ones at the top can possibly go off the map. I don't think we need. I think we've moved away from talking about the multi-force problem.
Okay.
At the moment, so if we think about the officer probably as the as the key actor with the key need that we want to address, and that we want to make life better for.
I'm gonna shrink this down. I'm gonna kind of
cool.
Throw it on the map here.
Amazing. Yeah. No, and I like this way of doing it because you're sort of building the value chain top down as well, which is quite nice. So I think we could probably lose systems and process as well, because I think those were more headings, weren't they?
They were great kind of placeholders for us to start.
Yeah.
What we wanted to talk about, and
absolutely.
We're gonna test some things out, see what works, see what doesn't.
Yeah. So I guess in terms of the officer, I always found this one an interesting one. Where to place the in terms of evolution, the user. I just tend to bung it off the map with an arrow coming in. Personally, I don't know what you do, but
something similar, right? Like I have a little like worthy mapping template paper that I carry around. And, like, I leave space at the top above the map to basically give the user a place to live. And the interesting thing is, like, the high level activity can be a need.
Yes.
Or something that I saw Jessica, she's Jessie Tron on Twitter. Both names. Jessie Tron on Twitter. One of the things she did that was like mind blowing to me was she put the need, like what the high level capability was doing for the user, on the relationship itself. So, like right here, like in order to get a warrant, or sorry, getting a warrant to carry out a search actually means that they get to do their jobs or serve justice or whatever that ends up being. So that's where that can live too. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's pretty cool. And I think that's one of the other things that I think probably in our previous conversation we both thought would be useful, but for a session like this is that that I think a number of times we've touched on things, which is there's no right way. And I think when I started, certainly I was much more of the what's the right way to do this?
Yeah.
And now it's just
totally
it's a tool on canvas, and actually there as long as you are if you're applying the techniques in a way that is useful to you and that is genuinely mapping the landscape in a meaningful way, and I think it's that piece that you want to get right, but actually you can use the tool to to denote different things in different ways, and that putting things along the edges is great, coloring in things is great, and then using the space in different ways. So cool. If we think about that, then the back office function is an interesting one because obviously, again, it's a well-defined thing for a force. They will have a well-defined back office function. So typically, I put something like that personally at sort of the edge of custom and product, in terms of it being probably more on the product edge in terms of it being relatively standardized, but with still with a reasonable level of flux within it. But what would you say on that one, Ben?
That's really the tough thing is when we start making decisions like this, we have to have a rationale behind it. And one of the things that Simon points at, like if you ever have trouble deciding where to put something, is that it might be a sign that it's too high level. And there's this quality of each component. So every component is itself could actually be exploded into its own map, and the map is just one single component on someone else's map, and all that kind of stuff means that when we're talking about the placement of components, we're talking about a dispositional quality. Like if I broke back office function apart and I looked at where all those components ended up landing, I'm like, thumb in the wind, this looks like it's averaging customish, productish. It's a guess, and that's okay. And the second thing is we're asking a very general question here, but I imagine in practice, if you were doing this in a client context, you would not be talking about just individual officers in general. You'd probably be asking about individual officers in Reading, or what that might look like in a specific place for them, and then you would have an answer, right? You could go look. You could say, how do they treat it?
Yeah,
Simon,
absolutely. And you're right. Genericizing this, yeah, does bring some challenges. Equally, I think that in itself points to the fact that in reality, if you look across police forces, their back office functions all work in relatively different ways, which says
yeah,
that you're not at the you're not at the highly commoditized end of evolution. You're much more likely to be somewhere to the left. So I think that's a really really good point. So then as we break down, then I think intrinsic knowledge is definitely sitting you know um, somewhere somewhere to the left hand side. Uh, and then yeah, as we move into the others, I think the police case management system, as we said, uh, it's probably correctly placed um, in terms of its value, but it's certainly more product and rental in this case.
got it. So I should shift it over here.
Yeah, I'd say so. Yeah.
Okay.
Um, fax machines on the other fax machines equally are I'd say furthermore clearly they're
Just gonna rotate
towards
here.
towards that edge on this side, but far lower, I'd say, in the value chain. Um, yeah. We've then got the verification itself. Again, that's near the bottom of the value chain, and I would say it's on that custom Genesis edge, because the way that it's happening is very much will let's say is very much dependent on that intrinsic knowledge, and we might even want to put an edge between intrinsic knowledge and verification, because
Mhm.
part of that might very well be informing that.
So intrinsic knowledge depends on verification,
And
or the other way
verification,
around.
yeah. Sorry.
Oh, so is
Sorry,
intrinsic knowledge.
verification depends on the intrinsic knowledge.
Got it. Got it. Okay. So this is one of the fun parts, right? Because whenever I start thinking about how to lay things out, um,
Yeah,
one
yeah,
of
because
the
the
things
intrinsic
Simon,
is far less visible than the verification, and we've sort of gone the verification is sitting near the bottom, right? So yeah, no,
that's
that's good.
that's the trouble. And what Simon says about the visibility, like the function of invisible or visible. I mean, you can basically compute it mathematically. Like where is it in the value chain? Like what position does it
Yeah,
hold in the value chain relative to others? But
yeah,
for us, we're trying to also make sense of this world, and if it helps us to actually, okay, these verification and police records case management configurations are technically at the same position in terms of visibility, but
yeah,
for us it's useful to distinguish them and give one more
absolutely.
weight and visibility than the other.
Yeah,
So you run
and
into
I
these
find that
situations, right?
I find that I tend to concentrate first, as you say, on the evolution, because it's in a sense it's more intuitive to a point,
Mm-hmm.
and then the placing on the value chain is sometimes a matter of actually contextualizing where in this value chain it sits.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Is there
So
something
yeah,
missing
let's.
here that's telling us the answer?
Sorry.
Like, is there something? Are there components here that are missing, or relationships that are missing that would tell us the answer? It's kind of
Yeah,
the
quite.
question I have. But also,
Yeah,
this is fine. It's wrong. Everything's
yeah.
wrong. But
Everything's right.
we made progress. We've learned something.
That's it, yeah. And then I think we have the records and case management configuration sitting, probably towards the edge of to the edge of custom and product, but definitely on the custom side of that. Yeah, and then we've got these other entities that we've got some supporting infrastructure that is possibly sitting in the product space, depending. I mean, one of the interesting things again early on is that I try to put in a lot of the underlying components, and again, sometimes stripping those away, gives you a much more clarified map,
Absolutely. Yep.
and not needing to always put power in there, because power's there underneath something and somewhere everywhere. But certainly that's something I've only been sort of conscious of relatively recently, is making sure that we focus on the area that we're focusing on. So
That's the
actually,
important thing is as you map, you discover that, right? You learn what decisions you're trying to make, and then you make curatorial decisions about what to include in the
yeah,
map. Like these components aren't relevant to this decision now. We're
yeah.
zooming.
No, absolutely right. And so I think in this case, we could lose supporting infrastructure off this altogether. Let's do that. And then I think then we've got an approval, which probably in the value chain is quite high, right? Because you're not going to get a warrant without the approval. And in this case, yeah, it's relatively evolved. Let's say you've then got the approvals interface, which is again coming out. So if we sort of let's make some assumptions here that everything it goes through the fax machine and it gets into the approvals interface somehow. Let's make that link.
The approvals depend
So
on fax machines.
Yeah, and then from there the approvals the approvals interface is going to the approving entity. And the approving entity again will be highly visible and will be, I'd say.
I'm just playing with this a little bit. So tell me what I'm doing right, what I'm doing wrong.
No. I think that's I think that's okay. I think the approving entity is higher on the value chain, much closer to the approval itself. Not as
that makes sense.
Not as high on the chain as the approver itself,
okay,
because
so
it's because they're approving it, right, and so they're important to the process and possibly from the officer's point of view, have some value there. So and let's lose for the sake of argument. Let's lose now support and secure area. I think those are probably distractors for the purpose of now what we've got down to, which is a warrant for a search. Let's assume you don't need a secure area because it's not not the type of warrant that requires.
Okay, and just to close the loop here on the approvals interface. So we're in the chain of needs. What are we saying needs the approval interface?
The approving entity.
Got it. Okay. Perfect. All right. And how do you feel about those placement there, or that placement?
Sorry, can we just get rid of the secure area access on the?
Absolutely.
So, I think the approving entity, you could say, is I always find it hard again how to place people on maps sometimes.
Of course, yeah.
Or functions. Let's say the entity isn't necessarily a person, but it's certainly a function. And we come back to the same, the same. I would often place it in the same place where I place the back office function there, which is somewhere between custom and product. In this case,
that makes sense.
It's something that's relatively consistently laid out in that sense.
And there are some other frames we can use to think about that component too. Like Simon points at the 4 component types, right? So you've got activities, you've got practices, which is how you do those activities.
Yeah.
Data, which is how you measure them, and knowledge, which is how we understand them. So like we can use any of those frames that we'd like. So what is it like to be what is the practice of how to approve something, how to be an approving entity? We can frame it like that too. So like lots of flexibility, not really like wrong ways to do that kind of thing.
No, indeed. And as you say, there's there will be underlying components to this that as you explode that out, definitely fall into all of those. All of those. There is there's the activity that they're doing to approve, which is very very much in there, as well as the knowledge they're applying, which is linked to a set of data which is passed through this approvals interface.
Absolutely.
So and at a gross level, you're right. That whole approving entity activity is probably reasonably thought out in that space. So I think let's say for the sake of argument, for the sake of this for this exercise, I think we've mapped this to a point that now we've got something that, as you say, we can now have further discussion with someone who is a domain expert and say, right, is this right, is this wrong?
What come in and contribute.
Why? And start to open up those those challenges. And partly that may lead to more nodes, partly that may lead to different placement, but that's as you say, that's good stuff. That's that's improving the map.
Yeah,
And
and
then
when
we
they
can look at,
contribute, yeah, like they actually take ownership of the map because their thoughts are being added. They see it represented.
absolutely, yeah, and that's when you can start to go, right, where are the opportunities here? What, how are these things all working together, and what challenges is this giving us?
Yeah. So where are the opportunities?
Yeah, and I think that's always the question that, in a sense, takes a while to answer, because, as I said before, you can look at that Genesis custom edge in the far left, and there is usually opportunity there, because you can move things into a more evolved state. But actually, so taking verification, for example, in this case, if verification is being, we're assuming here that the back office function is doing verification, in a very um, undefined, potentially changeable way, of a person going to another person, and through that process, verifying through some tacit knowledge that that person is that person. Now, systemizing it may, move it in a more evolved direction, but may also involve potentially more cost, but equally increase security, increase, the integrity of the whole process.
Right.
And so, this is where the opportunity discussion starts to come out, and saying, well, what would happen if I could evolve verification? What could happen if I could remove intrinsic knowledge from being part of this map at all? Why does it need to be here? And I think that's always a question, right? Why does this need to be here?
Yeah.
I think and I'm probably falling into this trap to some extent, even in this conversation, is, the temptation is to say, well, I need to shift everything to the right. I need to evolve
Of
everything to the
course, yeah.
ultimate point.
You want things to be like the way that they should be, and that I
Yeah,
think that's a natural desire. But
and we want everything to be best practice. And actually, part of the uh, art, to an extent, of interpreting maps, I've found, is to be really sensible in, one, which things you're moving, and two, how far you're moving them. And
yeah.
that's part of the, that becomes a more well defined um, activity that, involves asking the right questions, involves, and analyzing what the impacts are on the organization. But you've got to, equally being realistic about what it means about the future, the future environment, and the future landscape.
No, that's really interesting and important, and it's something that I've been sitting with a little bit lately. And it's the studying the climatic patterns and what's going to happen if you do nothing is a really interesting
Mm,
baseline. I think when you look at this system and you know that everything's going to evolve, and you know that
mm,
as those things evolve, they change. They have different characteristics. If and knowing that the people that are evolving those are like they're looking to the future, where if something shifts into commodity, it's going to form a sort of basically a building block for some new kind of value that we don't understand yet, that may be great, may be terrible, who knows.
yeah.
The sort of interesting first question is like, what's going to happen, like regardless of what we try to do? what
Yeah.
where can we anticipate points of change, basically?
Mm,
And you might be able to say something like, well, let's think about where back office functions are right now.
yeah.
43 different implementations of back office functions. I bet that there are probably one or two that are going to be doing something different in a way that pushes it forward. And it
Yeah.
would be interesting to see, like, what maybe something will happen where you know that there's going to be a new police force entity or something along those lines, where they're not going
Yeah.
to be
Yeah.
encumbered by the same kinds of problems. They're going to be able to just
Yeah, absolutely.
move.
So thinking about shared practices, thinking about how best practice propagates,
Yeah.
and whether there will be, especially when looking at, public sector type examples like this, legislative changes can have a huge impact, and being
Yeah, they
able
do.
to, you know, again, anticipate without having to anticipate with incredible accuracy, but anticipate what moves that's going to make in your landscape.
You don't know when, but you know probably it will. right? It's like,
Yeah.
it,
Yeah.
and that's in Simon's example that he gives in the book. It's about, uh, hey, it seems like compute infrastructure is really profitable, and it seems like there's a lot of sort of inertia there. So a new startup could come along and just not be encumbered by that and push it forward. And of course, Amazon, a bookstore, right, decides to go do that. So is there something equivalent here with legislation? Is there something equivalent here with any new actors in the space? That'd be really interesting to see if there are any like London startups that are really focused on public sector back office functions. What's likely
Yeah.
to happen?
Yeah, and I think this is where, for example, in the UK, we've got the Police ICT company who are looking at the standardization of systems around policing. So you could very well see in the future the landscape around police records and case management systems change over time. You could see that evolve much more into
Yeah,
the commodity space, right? And suddenly you've got a very different landscape that you're dealing with. And if that were the case, actually, could alongside that, the back office functions start to evolve, and actually there be some evolution of that verification process again that's sitting at that at that Genesis custom edge. I think that's that gives you some really interesting uh, you know interesting ideas to start exploring and then look at as concrete opportunities. So because you can then start to map out, well, what is the time horizon for this landscape change,
absolutely.
and
Yeah.
given that time horizon, what should we be doing and when?
And the other side of that is too, you can anticipate the resistance of the police forces to those changes. Even if the standards organizations come in with the perfect versions of these systems, there's still a transitionary period, right? And it's not like bad. Like they have systems that are working, and in fact, because people are involved, like the kind of services that they perform is like life and death. In like a lot of cases, it's keeping things working that's most important. So yeah, fancy consultants come in with their fancy systems, right? But you don't understand what it's like on the ground, man. Like that's the sort of resistance that's going to happen. So
Yeah.
how do we help them overcome that inertia and move forward to adopt things that ultimately make them more effective?
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I think that that's something that's really interesting to sort of overlay then into the map is right. That all of these arrows that we've started to draw on, those are implying a level of change, and a level of change that will be, regardless of what it is, will be resisted by some people to some extent. And so
Right.
there is again, planning the time horizon that happens over, and then thinking about what support needs to be made in order to make that change embed. Again, the map starts to tell that story, and as you then explode the back office function, because what this gives you is a really good picture where you're saying, right, we think the back office function, the case and records management system is going to move commodity by the operation of an overarching body. The opportunities that we potentially have as a force, let's say, as Reading, as Thames Valley Police in Reading, is to evolve the back office function and the verification. You can go, right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to explode the back office function now. I'm going to map and look at what are the components that are needing to evolve over this time period. What is it that is not sitting in a best practice space or in a good practice space that could move into a good practice space? And what we've done through this process over the last sort of 45 minutes on a pretty quick conversation
Yeah.
through a hypothetical situation is built a picture of something that now we can go to another level and start to plan some interventions and start to we start to get that focus. So we're going, right, we can focus in on back office, we can focus in on the opportunities in that space. Now let's drill down into that, and we get into, right, how is this working, and what can we move to particularly affect this this getting a warrant piece, but also where are the other opportunities there. And I think that idea of being able to quickly open up stories, quickly open up organizations, and pinpoint where these opportunities are is it's a really powerful technique, and it really helps with that focus, especially when people don't really have especially over here, don't have an incredible amount of money to spend on lots of
Yeah,
interventions. So
absolutely.
yeah, no, I think
Tim, this has been so fun.
I think. Yeah, no, it has been. Yeah, thanks, Ben. It's been really, really interesting, and I think just I think that act of challenging thought processes together, it shows why there's value in actually doing this as a group activity as well.
Right, absolutely.
Recently, we've been working with my team on mapping what we do in terms of offers and how we could therefore change it. And even in in the first session, which was like a couple of hour session together, you just heard language sort of starting to talk about evolution and value, and it's really
Yeah.
interesting, and people getting hold of that, and it is it is something that really can then drive either change or focus, which both outcomes are good.
Yeah. Change is coming. And so, and
Yeah,
focus is important because you only have so much time in the day, right? So much energy.
yeah,
That's
yeah,
awesome.
and so many resources. Yeah,
Yeah, frankly,
brilliant.
yeah. I think that's a really great place to leave off. I've
Yeah.
learned something about policing in the UK just by talking through this with you.
Well,
I knew almost
a
nothing
very
of it.
hypothetical
Of
police in
course,
the
yeah,
UK.
yeah. But from from a working model, we can actually start refining, right? We can start learning more
Yeah,
about it. And if we were making a base, what kind of decision could we make from this? Well, we could decide whether or not to try to serve police forces in the UK, see if there's an opportunity to help them push their back office function forward, or whatever it
yeah,
might end up being, right? So
yeah,
like it gives us enough information to start to make the next decision that's going to help us make the next decision, and so on and so forth. So
absolutely.
that's critical. Thank you so much for spending your time with me, Tim. I really appreciate it, and I'm excited to see how you apply these forward in the work that you're doing and how you apply mapping with your clients and everything. This is an exciting thing to see. Thanks for sharing your time with me and your thoughts as well.
Brilliant. No, thank you, Ben. It's really informative and exciting discussion, I think.
All right. Thanks so much, Tim.
Cheers.